Governor Visco, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
I'm going to call you Ignazio from now on, though.
Okay, good.
So let me start off with probably one of the biggest questions, which is, of course, going to be about monetary policy and about the ECB. So you've been very clear that you were supportive of the recent actions that the ECB took, which were considered fairly significant. Can you explain kind of your thinking behind why you were supportive, why you think this was the right thing to do, and how do you see it?
Thank you, first of all, thank you for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Obviously, you must have noticed the debate that has been taking place after our decisions in September, and there were some dissenting opinions that became pretty viral. Now, my point there was very simple. First of all, we had already decided in July, and our last meeting in July, that the need was for a strong, clear intervention on the part of the central bank if the inflation outlook would not improve as it was somehow in the projections that the ECB had at the time, and if the real outlook was not going to also to pass from what some said with some optimism, a transitory standstill. Indeed, in August, September, things did not improve. As a matter of fact, they deteriorated. It was clear that, at least in my perception, financial markets were pricing somehow a reduction in inflation. Inflation expectations were de-anchoring as much as we can say from looking at different indicators. There was evidence that they were going downwards after a period of slight recovery that had taken place until the spring. Secondly, the outlook, both in real terms as well as the indicators of orders and PMIs and so on, was also pointing for a longer than at the time expected period of stagnation at the euro area at large. And thirdly, we have to realize that even if we were successful in reducing and perhaps abolishing the risks of deflation in 2014-15, we still had very low actual inflation. In the last 7 years or so, we probably have had a rate of inflation of 1% vis-a-vis what we define as price stability, and there is a debate also on the definition of price stability, at around 2% or slightly below 2%. 1% is not slightly below, and inflation expectations were more or less pointing towards 1.5 and downward. We also had a lot of analysis, both from the staff and from ourselves in the bank, pointing out that the relation or correlation between short-term expectations of inflation and longer-term expectations was on the rise. And the options prices were pointing out to higher insurance against a reduction in inflation. So all these combined with the global outlook. The global outlook was clearly not improving. We talk a lot about geopolitical risks. But first of all, there are clear trade uncertainties, trade tensions, commercial tensions that are responsible for trade really growing at the lowest rate. Actually, it is negative rates of growth in the last 3 quarters, the lowest since the financial crisis. The geopolitical risks, well, we priced as relevant the risk of Brexit. Today is a different day. Perhaps that may be reduced, but still we have other risks that we were not foreseeing. Geopolitical risks in the Middle East were not foreseen as strong as they have developed. And also we had worse than expected results in China. So all this together, put together, led many of us to think that the strong action that we suggested, we all agreed should take place in July, had to take place in September. Now the package is a complex package. There are a number of components. There was not total agreement. There was total agreement that we needed a package, that we needed to somehow improve our monetary stance, make it easier. But there was not, as we realize, agreement on all the pieces of the package. Myself, I was not agreeing on some of these pieces. But at the end, I found it reasonable to have a combination of all these. The analysis that we have in the bank point out that the asset purchases are still more effective than the negative interest rates. Negative interest rates on the deposit facility, that is the reserves that banks maintain at the central bank above the compulsory ones, are those interest rates, negative interest rates, were not doing harm directly. As a matter of fact, they were more or less neutral. We may talk about this later, but what was most important was the combination of the various components, and at the end, the combination was positive. So this is where we are. Now, there's been dissent. If you want me to talk about this.
I do.
Well, first of all, we have to understand one thing, that if those who dissent are the only ones who go public, then clearly this is the vision that you are confronted with. So I think that given that I'm not a habit of talking about the decisions that we take, but given that this has been made public, I think we should. On the other hand, there is a debate whether dissenting opinions should be somehow made public, if that is necessary, if that is useful, or if that is negative. And many other central banks do actually attribute to the members of the councils that decide on monetary policy their views. We had a debate about that. Yeah. I think that the worst thing would be if it emerged that some of the positions that are taken in the Governing Council are taken because of national or particular interests. It is not so. The debate is very deep. We confront each other in a very civilized way. We go in depth with analysis. We have seminars, workshops, committees that are formed by our own staff that discuss the technical matters. There have been in the newspapers recently also some discussions about whether we followed or not the committee's advice. Well, first of all, there is no advice. There are technical discussions. There is no vote in the committees. There are views which basically at the end represent our own. And if the committee, Monetary Policy Committee in this case, but we have a legal committee, we have a market committee, had the view that of the various instruments, some were more effective in general, some were more effective now, some probably would have been better usable if particular data were available. It's so. Certainly, there was a letter written to the President of the ECB on this, from these committees. But at the end, we also had a span of time in September to realize that things were even worse than what the committees had seen. Now, I think personally that it would be a good thing if we, rather than expressing our views afterwards, or expressing it in the council as we do, yeah, but also in the terms that would be published. We discussed that. The majority of the council decided that that was not to be followed on a number of grounds. One of the grounds is that this way we would be less dependent on political scrutiny. I still think that if we are somehow capable of defending ourselves, we should do also in the face of in front of politicians. But This is a fact of life. So we have to come to terms on that, and we have to discuss within the Council a way, on one side, to be more transparent, on the other, to understand that if decisions are taken under our own personal responsibility, this is a personal responsibility. We are not reflecting the views of interested parties or political centers. So this is a tough issue because we may not have the same views given, however, the same facts. So we first have to agree on the facts. And secondly, we have to weigh the pros and cons. There are never only benefits from our actions. There are also costs. And at the end, if the benefits are above the costs and we realize the unintended consequences of our decisions, then we may take useful responses to deal with them as the time go on. One final point on what we decided was it has to do with also with a recommendation. A recommendation was to the political entities of the Euro area to engage in a real fiscal expansion on two grounds. The first ground is that to dispute the fact that monetary policy alone is insufficient or unable to achieve the objective, but to recognize, and this is the second issue, the fact that the combination, what we used to call the policy mix, which with the independence of central bank has been forgotten but has not disappeared, then really we should try to benefit from the combination of the two. And this, when prices are growing very low or even risk being on the negative side, then this mix is called upon to all parties, central banks, but also the fiscal authorities.
Well, speaking of that mix, thank you. First of all, I thought it was a very clear answer. Oh. Speaking of that mix, your former boss and the ECB president, Mario Draghi, essentially argued that going forward, we do need to think much more about the fiscal side. It can't just be all about monetary policy. But isn't this kind of where the problem in Europe sometimes exists, which is that the reality seems to be that countries that have a little bit more fiscal space are not willing to use it, and those countries that want to use more fiscal space don't have that fiscal space. Does this suggest then that the fallback is what we have to continue to rely on the ECB to be front and center on achieving the objectives of Europe?
No, I understand. I understand. The countries which have obviously fiscal space have two issues. The first is that themselves, and I think fiscal authorities really look at the domestic countries still, because there is no single fiscal authority at the euro area level. There is no single common fiscal capacity. So each one really looks at its own balance sheets, budget, and positions and debt, or the debt positions. It is clear that in these circumstances, if a country is doing fine, say close to full employment, however you define, decent growth rates, a current surplus in the balance of payments, then it is not encouraged really to engage in what is seen as an action that is for the benefit of others. But the crux of the matter is that it's not the benefit, it's the benefit of the area itself, from which exactly this country realize their current account surpluses, their ability to grow, and so on. So it is an issue of the common policies. And obviously there is another point. The other point is really cultural. Mm-hmm. In Germany, as you know, the debt means guilt. Not only debt. I mean, it means it's something not good. And obviously we know that there are circumstances which is no good. You said about fiscal capacity. Public debt in certain countries, my country, for example, is at a level which I would recommend not to increase for two reasons. First, because the burden of debt is high. Secondly, because the rate of growth of the countries is not high enough. But there are other countries in which there is a lot of space.
Yeah.
And there is also infrastructures in these countries which are demanding. So I think we have to continue somehow expressing our opinion, explaining also the fact that the mix of the two makes the recovery and getting out from a condition of risky inflationary processes, pointing perhaps to deflation in an environment at the world level which is negative, really the way forward. I'm confident of that. At the same time, if we talk about guilt, we have to remember that it is not only public debt that matters, it's also private debt.
Yeah.
Now, debt is useful because it allows many things. It allows, for example, to invest in areas which are profitable without having directly the resources to engage in this. It is useful to move funds from one period to the other and so on. But at the end, even in the private sector, if it is excessive, it may be dangerous. And there are countries in Europe, and Italy is not that, because Italy has the lowest household debt, and among the lowest corporate debt in Europe, and perhaps at the OECD level. But there are countries in the European Union, in the euro area, which have a private position which is dangerous. But this tells another thing, and tells that if by any chance we allowed a deflationary movement to take place, the spiral between debt and deflation would be really dangerous. And this is the reason, I think, that pushed us to be very, very responsible in 2013, 14, 15. And even those who at the time were somehow suspicious of the effect of these policies now recognize that it was really the right move. Perhaps some of them would not suggest this to take place now.
Very good. So you mentioned earlier the issue about negative interest rates, and I'm sure you hear this all the time. There's complaints across Europe about negative interest rates. How do you evaluate a little bit the complaints, a little bit the idea that maybe we're going to have low or negative interest rates for a longer period of time than was originally envisioned? And how does that affect the banking system overall, and particularly in Italy?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the negative interest rate environment is a normal environment. There are various reasons for these negative interest rates. In part, they might be justified by monetary policy being very loose, but nobody of us, I think nobody in this room, would have thought that negative rates would have been a possibility even 2, 3, 4 years ago. The basic thing is that this is the most unconventional of our monetary policy. But being very unconventional, I think we have to be very careful of the possible negative effects of negative rates. Yeah. And I would be very worried about a negative trap. But this is why we scrutinize very carefully. There are various reasons. First of all, it's not only monetary policy. It is this low for long is really a signal of a difficulty at the global level and in advanced economies especially to maintain decent productivity growth rates. Yeah. Notwithstanding the amazing technological change that we are living in. But clearly the market is somehow paying a high price for scarce resources, and think as a scarce resource exactly the German public debt, which justify the fact there is high demand and low supply, and then price reflects that. But the interesting thing about negative rates is that they have been mostly affecting banks. Well, obviously, the low rates are a crucial issue for insurance companies, pension funds, and so on.
Yeah.
And they have to be valued exactly vis-à-vis the rate of growth of the economies where they operate. But in the case of banks, negative rates clearly affect the margins, interest rate margins. Now, and so the question is, are banks' profits going to be affected by this? Answer is, we have not seen substantial effects. Overall, they have been neutral so far, as the bank's balance sheets are concerned, because they have allowed, together with the other measures that we have taken, for an expansion of loans, which has compensated the negative effect. But we introduced a two-tier system exactly to avoid the unintended consequence that, because at the end the effect may be negative on their profits, banks may shrink their loan supply. And that is the reason why we are on one side concerned, and the other, I would be very, very careful in going further in this direction.
Okay. So since the global financial crisis, which was roughly about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, Italy's economic growth has been flat with a few dips, and it's been hard to get moving in a faster clip. This has harmed the banking system, though I would say over the last few years, the banking system has done a very good job of cleaning up some of its balance sheets and so forth. Well, two things. One, how does Italy increase its economic growth so that we don't kind of continue to see these problems? And two, on the assumption that that could happen, will that help clean up the remainder of the banking system problems in Italy that we have seen over the last few years?
Well, first of all, we have seen problems in the banking sector, but they are, in my opinion, substantially the reflection of the problems of the real economy. You were right, Italy has had productivity growth problems since, not since the financial crisis, but even before.
Yeah.
There has been a lagged response on the part of the private sector to globalization and especially to technological change. And the industrial sector basically has capitalized on low wages rather than investment in capital goods and new capital goods. So this is an issue. The financial crisis produced a recession. The sovereign debt crisis, and I don't enter into the detail about that, which I think we could have spared that, but had produced a double-dip recession, very strong, the strongest recession in the history of Italy since 1861.
Yes.
10 years, really dramatic. And amazingly, the banking system did not collapse. I mean, I say amazingly. 10% fall in GDP.
Yeah.
25% fall in production, industrial production, 30% fall in private in investment, private and public. And we had a few banks which suffered dramatically, banks which were already in bad shape. Some say the supervisor should have seen it before. I claim that actually it was seen. The major problem is that we did not have the tools to deal effectively with the crisis management that normally these banks would ask for. Here you have the FDIC. We do not have in Europe an FDIC,
right.
And we were not able to use the instruments that we were using before because we had agreed to extend to the whole banking system the resolution framework that we designed at the FSB for the largest banks. So we had this. I understand we should have probably benefited from a better performance of these banks also in their loan concessions. We saw an increase in NPLs very, very substantial. At the end, however, as I was predicting, with the recovery, these NPLs have been disposed of. More should be done, but from a net position of 10% of total net of provisions, because this is what are in the balance sheets of overall NPL in banking system, we are now around 4 going towards 3. We have a large component now of these NPLs, which are not bad loans, but they are what we call unlikely to pay. These are loans which are a high likelihood to become bad, but a good part of them, say a quarter, can be restructured and go back in bonus. So we are working on that with the system. Banks, how many banks and which are the banks which worry us more? Well, first of all, Italy has 12 so-called significant banks, large, relatively large. And then it has net of co-ops, which are now being lumped together in 2 groups, which are significant, and they will be dealt jointly. We have about 120 banks. Of these, I would say a large component are banks very small, below 1.5 billion euros as assets.
Yeah.
These have more difficulty in cleaning their balance sheets. They probably should somehow outsource more, try to go to the market more, and they should be assisted if they are unable. At the end, there is no problem if you liquidate a bank, if you do it in an orderly way. We are looking for the orderly way in this case, and also for aggregation, the consolidation that still should take place. But not only these banks, but even the largest banks still have to engage more in cleaning the balance sheets. By now they are in better shape. Even rate of returns are back to, I would say, something closer to normal. But they have also to engage in reducing costs through also investing in technology. There is some improvements, but not enough in coping with the technological change, but still high value-added financial services lag behind, and I think this is where really most actions should take place.
Okay, thank you very much. We've run out of time, but I wanted to thank you for being very frank on your views, and good luck with I know you have a lot of meetings over the next few days. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.